Hello, this is John Cullen. Welcome to another I Am John Cullen podcast. This episode is going to address a question that I see rather frequently when I go on YouTube and I look at other research done by major media, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, CNN. When you read the comments or you read other comments on Twitter about the Las Vegas shooting, often I see questions, whatever happened? What happened in Las Vegas? As if people are still trying to figure out, I don't quite buy this Stephen Paddock story, but what did happen? Although we've produced, 240, 250 videos so far, I haven't really put out a video that addresses front to back. What do we think happened? And in this video, we're going to do that. We're not going to talk about who did it. We're just going to look at what happened. The first step, what's wrong with the narrative? Is there a problem with the narrative? And how do we determine that? That first step begins by, let's assemble the facts of the case.
So this is the report that the FBI...
The FBI announced its inquiry into the 1 October mass shooting is complete without any conclusion on why.
No clear motive in the 1 October shooting. The FBI issuing its final report today.
Today, after nearly 16 months of investigation, the FBI has found no specific motive.
This is the FBI's report on the Las Vegas shooting, October 1st, 2017. It's about 2.5 pages long, and that's the complete report. So when we see these tweets on Twitter or questions in the comment sections in YouTube on other videos, typically people are asking, what happened? And that's because people doubt that Stephen Paddock acted alone. People aren't buying the narrative. And so the first question is, why is that? Why is it that so many people doubt that Stephen Paddock acted alone? Why is it that so many people question the narrative? That's the first question we have to answer. The answer to the first question is really the construct for the second question, and that is, why do so many people suffer from cognitive dissonance when presented with the narrative of the Las Vegas shooting? And that's really what's happening, is when presented with the narrative, people are feeling cognitive dissonance. They're saying, wait, that doesn't feel right, that doesn't sound right, that's not consistent with what I'm seeing. So let's define cognitive dissonance before we go much further. What is cognitive dissonance? It's a certain type of feeling that you get when you see something that's not right, or you hear something that's not consistent with what you've seen. And I'm going to show you a couple examples that should trigger cognitive dissonance in you right now. So let's take a look at a couple examples of cognitive dissonance.
What happens when what you see and what you think you see are two different things? A door in the middle of a park.
People are wondering, where did the guy go? I'm wondering, why is there a door in a park?
I loved the disappearing through the door gag. It truly tricked me.
What you have here is an example of cognitive dissonance, that what you think happened and what you saw happen do not match. And it creates this anxious feeling because it doesn't make sense to you.
I would have done the exact same thing as many of these people did. I would have stood up, I would have researched it because I like to be tricked.
What takes place in this experiment is what's known as psychological misdirection. It's a magician's best friend. It's by diverting your attention one way, they can do a sleight of hand the other way.
They may think that person is gone, like disappeared from the face of the earth and is in some other land right now.
Now, depending on what's at stake, the way cognitive dissonance makes you feel will vary. So if what's at stake is something that's not that big a deal, we tend to laugh at the cognitive dissonance. And that's what magic is. Magic is cognitive dissonance. It's when you see something that shouldn't be. And that feeling that we get from it is exactly cognitive dissonance. But because so little is at stake, we don't get upset. We don't get visibly disturbed necessarily, and we find it entertaining. I'm going to show you two examples. The first example, there's not much at stake, so the cognitive dissonance is entertaining. The second example, a little bit different.
Awesome. So we're going to try something with the Rubik's Cube. We're going to mix it up on all 6 sides. Now there's 43 quintillion different ways you can mix it up, so watch that close. Completely mix it up, one-handed in the bag as fully as possible. Back to solve. I think you have a guess on how I do that, right? Some people guess there's a second cube in the bag. I will prove the bag is empty. Look, I'll check. Completely empty. Completely empty.
Can I look in it?
Absolutely. Very good. Simon, I'm going to do something that's never been done before on TV. Simon, can you actually mix up that Rubik's Cube? Turn it as much as you want. Now, every time you turn it, that's a different one of those 43 quintillion permutations. Simon, whenever you're happy, I will take the cube that you just mixed up and put it back in the bag. Watch that close. Simon's mixed up Rubik's Cube.
Well, that's incredible.
That would be an amazing trick if there was not a second Rubik's Cube in the bag. But that's not the trick. I'm making sure you're still paying attention. Simon, can you actually cover it up on all 6 sides? Cover it up? Perfect, like that. Yeah. Now, when you think of a solved Rubik's Cube, what do you actually picture?
Solids.
Colors, right? What if I told you that I found a different solution to the Rubik's Cube? Watch close. Right about there. See, the different solution was to match the Rubik's Cube that Simon mixed up 30 seconds ago.
You have.
No.
So if I did match it, you're going to notice we have one side that's going to be a completely perfect match.
Magic is real.
Better than one side, though. That's going to be side number 2. That is 3. That is 4. That is 5. That is all 6 sides a completely perfect match.
Now that's an example of cognitive dissonance where not that much is at stake. It's a Rubik's Cube. So whether or not it's correct or not, or whether or not it matches or not, there's not that much at stake. Now what happens if we step up the illusion to something where there's a little bit more at stake? What does cognitive dissonance feel like? Let's take a closer look at that. Let's raise the stakes a bit and see what does cognitive dissonance feel like using magic. What we know from studying cognitive biases is that as the stakes are raised, the degree of cognitive dissonance increases. And so in this clip, we raise the stakes. David Blaine is going to perform.
Through this area over here?
Yeah, it's like all different places it comes out.
Right.
And what's at stake now is a whole lot more than just a Rubik's Cube. So watch closely and get in touch with the feelings that you get watching this, because this is similar to the feelings that you get when we start talking about the LVMPD forging evidence. It's a similar feeling of discomfort. The feeling of disbelief, the feeling of incredulity, the feeling of dismissal, confusion, anger, it's very common and it's normal. You're being presented with something that shouldn't be, that shouldn't happen based on everything you've ever known, everything you've learned. All of your life experiences tell you that what you're seeing shouldn't be happening. And this is very similar to the feeling that you get when we start talking about that the Las Vegas Metro Police Department forge evidence. The feelings are very similar. And that's cognitive dissonance. In order to address what do we believe really happened that night, October 1st, 2017, let's go back to questions number 1 and question number 2. Question number 1, why do so many people doubt that Stephen Paddock acted alone? Why is that? So now we just looked at cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when what you see, what you hear, doesn't quite match up with what you've been told or what you believe. So that's the first reason, is that what people were seeing, what people heard, doesn't match up with there being one gunman. And so cognitive dissonance is triggered. Question number 2, why do so many people suffer from cognitive dissonance when presented with a narrative? And the reason for that is that there's a pretty big gap between the narrative, that there's a lone gunman who's 64 years old or what have you, and what is witnessed on the video footage. So what we see on the video footage, what we hear on the video footage, just isn't consistent with there being a lone gunman. And that's what triggers the cognitive dissonance. The other issue is that deductive reasoning doesn't match up with the evidence that's presented. In other words, the key things you would expect to see aren't quite there. Couple of items are there, right? We've got a dead guy on the floor, we've got a lot of guns, and we've got a lot of ammunition. So it appears that we might have a shooter in 32-135. But as we peel the onion further and we look for the other pieces, the other components that would be necessary in order for the crime to have been perpetrated from room 32-135, in other words, the next level of investigation, are there spent shell casings, roughly equivalent to the scale of the attack? In other words, are there 1,000 shell casings near the window somewhere? Which window in the room, in room 32-135, did the shooter supposedly fire out of? And what's the earliest time of day that we see evidence that this window is broken? And where do we see that evidence? Which footage? Is that on body cam footage? Is that on civilian eyewitness footage? And if so, where? Is there any body cam footage to corroborate the gunfire coming from 32-135? Do we see any muzzle flash coming from 32-135 in any footage? And if so, where's that? When we look at the definition of deductive reasoning, the process of proving a theory using formal logic that guarantees logical certainty, it starts with the theory, which in this case is that Paddock is the lone gunman and killed everybody from room 32-135, and seeks supporting observations in a top-down direction. And that's what we just looked at. We started with the theory, which is this guy must be the gunman because he's surrounded by guns and ammo and he's dead on the floor. And the supporting observations that we're looking for now are, all right, the window should be broken, there should be 1,000 rounds of spent brass, etc., etc. And we don't see those supporting observations. That's what creates the cognitive dissonance. And that's where we start to veer away from deductive reasoning, because we do not see the supporting observations. They're just not there. And so that sends us on a different quest, where instead of using deductive reasoning, we have to use bottom-up logic, which is inductive reasoning, which is where we simply just start watching footage. And we watch, and we watch, and we listen. And then based on hundreds, if not thousands of observations, we formulate a hypothesis. And that's inductive reasoning. Most people, unless they are a student of or an investigator of the Las Vegas shooting, have not seen the footage of Officer Brosnahan going to the window. And that's because the New York Times edited that footage out of their coverage. Same with the Associated Press. They edited out that sequence where Brett Brosnahan goes to the window. So most people have never seen that footage. And that's one of the key elements that's missing, which is we don't see 1,000 rounds of brass casings on the floor underneath Brosnahan's feet as he walks to the window. We also don't see that hammer, that little sledgehammer on the floor. So this creates cognitive dissonance for us, but most people haven't seen that footage. But this is what creates the cognitive dissonance. This is why people start questioning, did Paddock actually do this? Was the crime committed from 32-135? Is that where the shooter really was? And it's based on this evidence, and this evidence was not presented by the New York Times. It was not presented by the Associated Press, and that makes you wonder, why is that? And we don't see a whole bunch of broken glass and 1,000 spent brass casings or a small hammer where he'd be standing on it. The problem is the public hasn't seen this footage because the New York Times cut it out, or they edited it. Further compounding the cognitive dissonance is the fact that we only have one body cam, the body cam from Josh Bitsko. We don't have any other officers' body cams. And since only 8 rounds were found in 32-134, that would mean the balance of the attack would need to have come from 32-135, and we don't see evidence of that. Here comes the official body cam footage, unedited, from the LVMPD.
We do not have a broken window. No, there's several rooms. You remember one window right where that curtain is right by the door. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. It is us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here. Go ahead, Todd.
But since the LVMPD only found 8 rounds, 8 spent cartridges in 32-134, that would mean the balance of the attack would need to have come from 32-135. That would mean the window in 32-135 would need to be broken. So back to deductive reasoning, to come to the conclusion that Paddock did this and did this entirely from room 32-135, we would need to see supporting observations, supporting evidence of that. And we simply don't see it. We don't see it presented by the LVMPD to the public. We don't see it presented by the FBI. And we don't see it in the single body cam that's been presented. We don't see it in any of the eyewitness footage. This brings us to a significant checkpoint. This is a key checkpoint in the decision matrix, which is there sufficient evidence at this point to abandon the primary premise? The primary premise being that Paddock is the lone gunman, he acted alone, everything was done from 32-135. So if there is sufficient evidence to abandon the primary premise, then we go looking elsewhere. And that happened for us very quickly, very early. We simply don't see what appears to be 1,000 spent brass shell casings on the floor. We simply don't see what appears to be the broken glass from the window on the floor. The chair isn't moved, and so the crime scene itself and the evidence that is presented and the evidence that's not been presented leads us to the conclusion that the narrative is not consistent with the evidence from the crime scene. We have no motive, we have no gunshot residue on Paddock, there's no forensic link between any of the weapons in the room and any of the victims. The chest wound on Paddock's autopsy, it's not there. No evidence that the window in 32-135 was broken until the next morning. No photographic or video evidence of gunfire coming from 32-135, and no body cam footage from any officer other than Josh Bitsko. Based on the evidence we've presented so far, if you're not ready to abandon the primary premise that Stephen Paddock acted alone, and you think that there's still ample evidence that he did, then we simply disagree. If you're not ready to abandon the primary premise, though, we ask that you go to question number 3, and let's review question number 3. Question number 3 asks, is there sufficient evidence presented by the LVMPD and the FBI that links Stephen Paddock to the murder of 58 people? And what evidence exactly is that? The next step in the investigation is to answer the question, were there any shots fired from 32135 or 32134? Is there any video evidence whatsoever to support gunfire coming from either of the two rooms? So let's take a closer look at that.
Shots fired, shots fired, shots fired.
So we do see gunfire coming from 32134, and that means, something bad was happening up in that suite.
Shots fired, shots fired.
So once again, we find ourselves coming back to this checkpoint. Is there sufficient evidence or lack of evidence to abandon the primary premise that everybody was shot and killed from room 135 on the 32nd floor? Is there a lack of evidence? Is there sufficient evidence that we can move on from that premise?
Mark Stein is an author and columnist, and he joins us tonight. So, Mark, look, I'm not a conspiracy nut at all, and I'm desperately hoping the authorities will prevent me from forming my own conspiracies to explain what is becoming increasingly inexplicable. But it looks like that interview you just saw, and I'm putting air quotes around the word interview, was managed by MGM, and that's why they put him on Ellen's show. Does that give you confidence that the public, which has a right to understand what happened, is learning anything meaningful about this story?
No, and I'm not a conspiracy nut either, but you're entitled to be one on this, Tucker, because whether by intention or design, nothing is proceeding normally in this case, up to the absurdity where someone says, I'm only going to give one interview and I'm going to give it to Ellen DeGeneres. And Ellen...
Exactly.
And I've got nothing against Ellen.
I don't either.
But it seems very a weird choice. And as you say, she manages to say, well, you are a true hero because by getting shot in the leg, you saved so many lives. That's not what happened. That was the old narrative.
Exactly.
The old narrative was that he interrupted the gunfire, took a shot in the leg, and brought the massacre to a halt. And then the sheriff said, oh, no, sorry, is that what I said? No, absolutely sorry, I got things the wrong way round. Actually, Mr. Campos got there before the mass shooting started, and then apparently the shooter took, between shooting Mr. Campos in the leg, there was then a 6-minute delay before he started massacring everybody, during which time he had a nice cup of tea or called down to room service or whatever he did. And then the hotel said, no, that's not what happened. There's a third timeline, and then everybody does the obvious and says, well, why don't we ask Mr. Campos what happened? And then they say suddenly, oh no, he's disappeared, he's gone now, he's off the scene, no one's seen him for a week. And then he comes back and he's on the Ellen DeGeneres show. And that's how conspiracy theories start, and everybody is entitled to take a flyer on whatever conspiracy theory they want in this case, because for whatever reason, officialdom and Mandalay Bay and and the Ellen DeGeneres show have muddied the waters to total impenetrability now.
Well, that's exactly, I think it's so nicely put, because it's clear. And by the way, simply because MGM managed this interview doesn't mean that it's inaccurate or that, I'm not attacking MGM, but I also think it was managed. Clearly, it was managed.
Right. Well, it is. It's a devastating time, and it's unfortunate. And, we have been talking about active shooters in the past, and it's unfortunate it did occur here. But we have responded to the scene, and we're doing the best we can to provide safety for the survivors. And right now, we believe it's a sole actor, a lone wolf type actor, and we have the place under control.
So the question now is, do we believe Sheriff Joe Lombardo? Do we believe the narrative? Is the evidence there to support the narrative? And this is where we start getting into the illusions. And what do we believe happened that night? And what we believe happened was that the LVMPD forged evidence in 32-135 so that they could make the claim that this was a lone gunman and he's dead. Case closed. Everybody go back to the gambling tables. We believe that was the LVMPD's motivation. Simply to calm the public. In other words, you have a choice. You either go outside and tell everybody, we've got the guy, he's dead on the floor, he's surrounded by guns and ammo, and we've got him. Or you go outside and say, well, there's a guy upstairs who's dead, surrounded by guns, but there's only one broken window and 8 spent casings, and there's 1,000 rounds that were fired, so whoever did this isn't caught yet. And that was the alternative. The alternative was to tell everybody the truth, that the guys who did this got away with it, and were still at large. And that was something that in a town like Las Vegas, that's a death knell. You can't do that. You can't tell everybody they're still at large.
But we have responded to the scene, and we're doing the best we can to provide safety for the survivors. And right now we believe it's a sole actor, a lone wolf type actor, and we have the place under control.
Is there a contradiction between the evidence presented by the LVMPD and what we actually see and hear on the eyewitness videos and photographs? And this section alone causes even more cognitive dissonance, because when we take a closer look at the photographs, when we take a closer look at the videos, again, it's not consistent with what you've been told, and it's not consistent with what you've been told by authority figures, by the sheriff, by the FBI. And so that's what causes such severe cognitive dissonance, is when authority figures lie to you. On May the 2nd, 2018, Shepard Ambellis of IntelliHub breaks the story that the window in 32-135 isn't broken, and that there's radio chatter about the window, and that it's simply not evident. There is no evidence that the window in 32-135 is broken. We do see evidence that 134 is broken, but in this back and forth between the patrol officers and dispatch, we have confirmation that only one window is broken, not 2. And if you're still not convinced, let's take a look at the BBC footage. The BBC footage does a real nice job of showing us the window in room 134 and 135, and clearly one of them is broken and one of them is not.
Hotel room on the 32nd floor.
The empirical method requires multiple observations from multiple sources, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Multiple sources showing us the same phenomenon from different perspectives. So regardless of which photograph we look at, which video clips we look at, we always see room 32-134 appearing broken, and we never see 135 appearing broken. So that creates a big problem for the narrative. The narrative doesn't stand up to the evidence. The BBC footage is consistent with our hypothesis, which is that one window was broken during the attack 32-134, and that the window to 32-135 wasn't broken until later that night. That creates the illusion. And so there's simply a lack of evidence that the narrative is in fact what took place. So deductive reasoning falls apart. When you look at this frame grab, this is a still frame from the video, do you see broken glass underneath Officer Brosnahan's feet? Do you see 1,000 spent shell casings? Do you see him standing on a small sledgehammer? Because we don't see any of that. And it's, regardless of what we're told is supposed to be there, it does not appear to be there. So if it's not there, it's not there. What do you see? Let's watch the New York Times footage side by side with the official footage.
Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here. Go ahead, Todd.
And just that quick, they cut away. So the New York Times cuts away within 2.2 seconds. And now we have to ask ourselves, why? Why not just let the video play? New York Times cuts away, Brett Brosnahan's still at the window. Why is this not the big reveal from the New York Times, is that the officers found the window that he was shooting from. And it's because there's no broken glass on the floor, there's no bullets on the floor, and not one of these other officers' body cams were presented to the public. Not one.
Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here.
Isn't it strange that the Associated Press did the same exact thing? The Associated Press's video was published on YouTube on May the 2nd, which is the same day that IntelliHub's Shepard and Bellis broke the story that the window was not broken. So with a 1.9-minute clip, how is it possible that the Associated Press didn't notice that the window wasn't broken? How is it that the New York Times didn't notice that the window wasn't broken? And how did both of them decide to edit out the same pivotal footage? How did that happen? Was that just an accident? Was that a coincidence? Or was it something more nefarious?
Right where that curtain is, right past the door. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here. Go ahead, Todd. Copy that. Already done. It's right here.
That was the complete footage. Just like the New York Times decided to edit the moment Officer Brett Brosnahan went to the window in 32-135, the Associated Press made a very similar edit choice. We find that really curious. In fact, we find it suspicious. Two completely different news organizations make the same edit at the same point. Why is that? You just watch the entire unedited footage. Now let's take a look at the edit points that the Associated Press chose to make. You'll see them as white flashes in the video.
Breach. Go ahead, Todd.
Both the Associated Press and the New York Times edited out the same exact section. I'm going to play that section for you, and it's missing from both the New York Times and the Associated Press's version. The section that I'm showing you is less than 10 seconds long. So the question is, why did the New York Times edit this out? Why did the Associated Press edit this out? Was that a free choice?
Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here.
we're going to superimpose the original LVMPD footage over the New York Times video and show you what the New York Times cut out. So in the upper left-hand corner is the original footage, and the big screen is the New York Times version of the story.
Right where that curtain is, right by the door. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us us. We have to go ahead. Up here, in the room. Go ahead, Todd.
Earlier, I asked you if this was evidence or we saw evidence that the LVMPD participated in a cover-up and forged evidence in order to create a believable crime scene. Now we're seeing the mainstream media reporting the story differently than the way it unfolded. Both the New York Times and the Associated Press leave out a pivotal 10 seconds of footage, and the question is why? Why would they both do that? Why is that footage missing from everybody's reporting? Now that you've seen that both the New York Times and the Associated Press have omitted the same footage from inside the suite, the evidence is piling up. So let's come back to the question, what do we believe happened October 1st? Based on the evidence, we formulate a hypothesis. So the evidence doesn't show us 2 broken windows on the 32nd floor. The evidence shows us 1 broken window on the 32nd floor. We don't see the second window broken until much later that night, after midnight. We do believe, however, the 2 windows were broken, just not both on the 32nd floor. We believe Lucas Brook witnessed the glass falling from 32-134, but we also believe that this event at 9:47 shows another window breaking. We scaled the footage to match the size of the building, and by canting the building the same degree as it is in the video and lining everything up, we were able to figure out where this event was taking place. Was this Paddock's room? Is this 32-135, or is this somewhere else? And so by scaling and overlaying the images, we were able to determine that this was not 32-135. This is much higher up on the building. This was more like the 37th or 38th floor on the building, not the 32nd floor. And you can see that as we gradually fade in the daytime view of the building and keep the arrow pointed at the same spot. It's not even close to the 32nd floor. It's about the 38th floor. And the reason the 38th floor is relevant and important is this is where we introduce who potentially might have been behind this. And this is where we get to who owns the Four Seasons, who are the dominant investors. But in this podcast, we're not going to talk about who. We're just talking about what do we think happened. So we now have seen evidence that something happened at 9:47 upstairs. 37, 38, somewhere at the Four Seasons. And then there's additional evidence in the form of body cam footage that corroborates potentially that this window was broken, that this is up on the 37th or 38th floor at the Four Seasons, and the window is on the north side of the building facing the Luxor, right? The glass where we see this explosion or something is on the north side of the building facing the Luxor up at the Four Seasons. And the reason that's important is the set of clips we're going to play for you now. In this series of clips, you're going to hear officers who are outside the hotel describing a window that's broken in another room. And so we believe that what they're describing is what we just saw at 9:47 p.m. The window that we believe was broken at 9:47, we believe these officers are describing in the footage you're about to see now.
What do you need, Levi? You guys, there's a window that faces east. You have another broken window out that we're focusing on, but we just need to make sure if you guys are in there or not because there is a little bit of movement. It's clear. One suspect down. All officers are code 4. Keep pushing. We still don't have to do a sweep for victims. Keep pushing. It's right here. We are facing north. Just confirming that is you guys that's in the broken window that faces the Luxor. Just confirming that is you guys that's in the broken window that faces the Luxor. Here, facing the 11th floor, we do not have a broken window. Okay, copy. It looks like you might have another room that has a broken window that also faces the Luxor off that north end. There's a little bit of movement unknown if it's going to be the curtains or not. I'm going to be working to get a better eye on it. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. We're looking for broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. Tell us it's us.
So what do we believe happened? We believe the police outside the building are looking at the window from the 37th or 38th floor. From the event that we saw at 9:47 p.m., we think they're looking at that window, and that window is broken. So that's what we believe happened. We've also said that we believe the LVMPD broke the window in 32-135. Now, is that based on a hunch or is that based on evidence? That's based on this evidence. This is 12:23 a.m. and we see an event take place at what looks like the 32nd floor. And this appears to be somebody blowing out the window on the 32nd floor. In fact, it looks remarkably similar to what we saw at 9:47 p.m. Not only do we believe that this footage is video confirmation of the window in 32-135 being broken, we believe we picked up audio of the window being broken at the same exact moment on body cam. So we think we've been able to corroborate that the window was blown out at 12:23 a.m. through body cam footage from two officers that were inside the hotel. And we picked up their body cams and we heard something at exactly 12:23 a.m. And the question is this the corroboration that we need for the event that we just witnessed, the video? Is this the audio to go along with it that confirms that the window in room 32-135 was in fact broken at 12:23 a.m.? The body cam footage I'm about to play for you was recorded from the 26th floor of the hotel. So this is 6 floors below the 32nd floor. And there are two officers moving through the hotel. It's taking place at 12:23 a.m., exactly the same time as the video footage we just saw. Listen very carefully and tell us if you think we're hearing the confirmation of what we just saw in the earlier footage.
Hey, sir. Hey, can you hear me?
Not only do we have cognitive dissonance because the crime scene doesn't match what we've been told, but now it's becoming evident that the LVMPD forged evidence and potentially broke the window to 32135. If the window wasn't broken in the room during the attack, that means Stephen Paddock didn't shoot everybody, because the window would have to be broken first. And since there's no video evidence of gunfire coming from that room, there's no photographic evidence of gunfire coming from that room, and none of the weapons were matched to any of the victims, right? There's no ballistic matching that's been done. So based on all of that, we begin to start looking elsewhere to say, okay, where might the shooters have been? If Stephen Paddock was not the shooter, where were the shooters? Where were they? We started looking in Google Earth, and using Google Earth, we're looking at the rooftops of the other buildings. And it seemed like if there were shooters on the rooftops of the Tropicana, the Excalibur, that might make some sense. So, using Google Earth, we started looking around and figuring out, all right, which of these hotels would make a good vantage point to shoot people from? And then, do we see anybody in the eyewitness footage? So first we use Google Earth, then we turn to the eyewitness footage to see, do we see people shooting from the rooftops? What we found was that no, we did not find shooters on the rooftops. What we saw were aircraft. We saw aircraft between the buildings. We saw aircraft flying in spaces they're not supposed to be in. And what made this difficult to comprehend is that there are tourist helicopters in the airspace all the time. So we had to research a system of record called Flight Radar 24. And what we did was we looked at these videos, and then we looked at the time of day, and we looked at this time of day on Flight Radar 24, the day of the attack, and said, okay, are these aircraft on Flight Radar 24? And the disturbing part was that no, none of them were. So we see aircraft in the eyewitness video footage, but the aircraft are not on the Flight Radar 24 recording, so they're not accounted for. We see Sundance helicopter tours depart and return at 10 p.m. And then we see Maverick helicopters depart at 10:12 p.m. But in the period of time between when Sundance lands and Maverick departs, there's no air traffic in this airspace between Mandalay Bay and Delano near the Luxor, and yet we see all these aircraft back there. So this is, again, another cause for cognitive dissonance. We see nothing on flight radar, yet we see things clearly in the video footage. And the question is, well, who are these guys? And what are they doing? If that's not Sundance and it's not Maverick, and the police haven't arrived yet, the police don't arrive until 10:22 p.m., and this is taking place at 10:09. So who is this? And we start to look for more evidence of this aerial phenomenon. Do we see this on multiple videos? And the answer to that is yes. We repeatedly see aircraft between Mandalay Bay and Delano, and we see it on eyewitness cameras, and we see body cam footage from the LVMPD. And on the LVMPD body cam footage, we see aircraft occupying airspace where there's nothing on flight radar. More eyewitness footage showing aircraft between Mandalay Bay and Delano. When we check flight radar, there's absolutely nothing there. And then we see aircraft behind the Excalibur on this footage. So repeated observations of aircraft and no aircraft appearing on flight radar 24. So this is suspicious. We see aircraft. They're between the buildings. They're flying around the venue. They do not appear to have navigation lights on. They're flashing rather irregularly. And there's nothing on flight radar. Nothing in the vicinity of the venue on flight radar. So because of this, we believe these aircraft are particularly suspicious. It's not Sundance. It's not Maverick. And it's not the police. So who are these aircraft? And what are they doing? Once we were convinced that the narrative was just not the case and that Stephen Paddock did not act alone, we went looking for where could the gunman possibly be? Where are the shooters? And after studying hundreds of videos and thousands of hours, what do we see? What do we think happened? We think this was an aerial attack. And we base this on evidence, on video evidence, on photographic evidence from multiple official LVMPD body cams, from eyewitness videos, from multiple angles, from multiple perspectives. And again and again and again, we see the same phenomenon. Aircraft in airspace that's not accounted for on Flight Radar 24. Sundance has landed already. Maverick has not yet taken off. And the police don't arrive until 10:22 p.m. So let's review the questions that we went over today. Question number 1 was, why do so many people doubt that Stephen Paddock acted alone? We looked at cognitive dissonance, and we looked at when the evidence that's presented doesn't match up with the narrative, it creates this cognitive dissonance. It creates this disturbing feeling that what I'm being told and what I'm being shown are not the same thing, and that there's an inconsistency here. The second question that we asked was related to the first question, which is, why do so many people suffer from cognitive dissonance when presented with the narrative? And we took a closer look at it, and it's because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that Stephen Paddock did not act alone. There is no muzzle flash from 32-135, and so on and so forth. Did the LVMPD and the FBI present enough evidence to link Stephen Paddock to the murder of 58 people? Is there evidence presented that any shots were fired from 32-135? Is there any video evidence or photographic evidence of that? We offered a checkpoint and said, is there sufficient evidence to abandon the primary premise? And if not, let's go back and revisit. But with no motive, no gunshot residue, no forensic link between the weapons and the victims, we were ready to abandon the narrative. We asked if the LVMPD forged evidence and forged the crime scene, and then we presented evidence that's the reason why we believe that they did. We showed you the window being broken at 12:23 a.m. And then we asked if there's a contradiction between the evidence presented by the LVMPD and what we see and what we hear on the videos. And the answer to that was yes, there is a contradiction. Is there a contradiction between the evidence and what we see being reported by the mainstream media? We looked at the New York Times and the Associated Press omitting key elements. And then, of course, we asked, what do you see in the sky? Who are they? What are they doing? And doesn't this warrant further investigation?